Ambassador Kethril stood at the viewing window of the flagship Eternal Mandate and watched the greatest armada in galactic history gather before his 4 eyes. 40,000 warships from 12 different species filled the darkness of space like angry stars coming to life. And each one of them had come for the same reason they had come to crush humanity. The Varanthi commander clasped his clawed hands behind his back and let out a slow breath of satisfaction as more ships dropped out of faster than light travel. Every minute the crystalline hegemony had sent there mirror ships that could reflect energy weapons back at attackers, and the insectoid Krix Collective had brought their swarm carriers filled with millions of drone fighters. Ancient Mormathi had awakened their planet crackers from 1,000-year slumbers, and even the peaceful Etherians had contributed medical vessels and support craft to the, because this was the might of the Concord of 12. And no species in the history of the galaxy had ever survived their united wrath. Kethril turned to his aide, a young Varanthi named Desik, who was experiencing his first real military campaign. Contact the other fleet commanders, Kethril ordered in his rumbling voice. Tell them we will send the ultimatum to Earth within the hour. Desik's scales rippled with nervous excitement as he hurried to obey. The ambassador returned his gaze to the window and thought about how the humans had brought this upon themselves through their own stubborn arrogance for 200 years. Humanity had existed as a minor presence in the galaxy, colonizing a handful of star systems and trading peacefully with their neighbors. They had seemed harmless enough at first, just another young species finding their way among the stars. But then they had done the unthinkable using some obscure loophole in ancient galactic law. The humans had claimed 17 resource-rich worlds that the Concord had been planning to divide among themselves. When confronted about this theft, the human diplomats had simply smiled and pointed to the legal documents that proved their claim was valid. They had beaten the Concord at their own game, and they had done it with a grin on their faces. That insult alone would have been enough to warrant punishment. But the humans had gone even further when the Concord demanded that humanity accept client species status and submit to the authority of the elder races. The humans had refused. They had actually said no. Species had ever said no to the Concord, and Servervad Tisik returned to the ambassador's side with a datapad in his trembling claws. All fleet commanders are standing by for the transmission. Ambassador, the young aide reported. The humans have been monitoring our arrival since we entered their system, but they have not raised any defensive positions. Kethril found this curious, but not surprising. What defense could the humans possibly raise against such overwhelming force? Their entire military fleet numbered fewer than 200 vessels, and most of those were small patrol craft designed for fighting pirates rather than proper warships. The math was simple and brutal. The myth. Concord outnumbered humanity 200 to 1. Open a channel to Earth. Kethril commanded. Let us give these creatures one chance to save themselves from total annihilation. The main view screen flickered to life and showed a large chamber filled with human military officers in there. Strange cloth uniforms. Kethril had studied human anatomy and found them to be rather unremarkable. Creatures with only 2 eyes, no claws, no scales, and no natural weapons of any kind. How they had survived long enough to reach the stars was a mystery to him. Female human with gray hair and sharp eyes stepped forward to face the screen, and Kethril recognized her from intelligence reports as Fleet Admiral Chanwei Lin, the Supreme Commander of Earth's Defense Forces. Ambassador Kethril, the human said in a calm voice. We have been expecting you. Then you know why we have come, Kethril replied with cold authority. The Concord of 12 demands the immediate and unconditional surrender of Earth and all human colonies, and you will accept client species status under Varanthi's supervision. and your military forces will be disbanded effective immediately. And any resistance will result in the complete destruction of your species." He paused to let the weight of his words sink in. "You have 1 standard hour to accept these terms. And if you refuse, we will begin our attack. And we will not stop until every human." World is ash. Catherall expected fear. He expected panic and desperate pleas for mercy. He expected the humans to fall to their knees and beg for their lives as so many species had done before them. Instead, Admiral Chen Weilin did something that made no sense at all. She laughed. It started as a small sound, barely audible over the transmission. But then it grew louder and stronger until the Admiral was laughing with her whole body, and then something even stranger happened one by one. Every officer in the room behind her began to laugh as well. Generals and admirals, men and women who were staring at certain death, stood there and laughed as if Catherall had just told them the funniest joke in the universe. The ambassador felt his scales prickle with an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to identify. It was unease, silence. Catherall roared, his patience breaking. "Do you not understand your situation? You are outnumbered and outgunned beyond any hope of victory. Your species faces extinction. Why do you laugh?" Admiral Chen managed to control herself enough to wipe tears from her eyes and face the screen again. "Forgive me, Ambassador," she said with a smile still playing on her lips. "It is just that we have been waiting for this moment for a very long time. And now that it is finally here, we find ourselves quite relieved." "Relieved?" Catherall repeated in disbelief. "You face annihilation, and you feel relief?" "You would not understand," the Admiral replied. "Your species has never had to fight for survival the way we have. And you have never known what it means to stare into the abyss and laugh, because crying would take too much effort." She straightened her uniform, and her expression shifted from amusement to something harder and more dangerous. "We will not surrender, Ambassador, and we will not submit, and we will not beg for mercy that we know you will never give. So bring your 40,000 ships, and bring your planet crackers, and your swarm carriers, and bring everything you have, because it will not be enough." The transmission and Catherall stood in stunned silence as the view screen went. Doc Thessig's voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "Ambassador, why were they not afraid? Why did they laugh at us?" Catherall had no answering all his years of conquest. In all the dozens of species he had helped bring under the Concorde's control, he had never seen anything like this. Fear was the natural response to overwhelming power, and submission was the logical choice when facing certain defeat. But these humans had looked at death itself and smiled. "Send word to all fleet commanders," Catherall said slowly, his voice uncertain for the first time in centuries. "We attack in 1 hour, and there will be no mercy shown." But even as he gave the order, the ambassador could not shake the cold feeling that had settled in his chest. Something was wrong here. Something was very wrong, and somewhere deep in the void of space, in hidden places the Concorde had never thought to look, ancient weapons hummed to life as humanity prepared to teach the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. Intelligence Chief Morvax of the crystalline hegemony floated before the assembled commanders of the Concorde fleet and projected images from his vast database onto the central display. His body was made of living crystal that caught the light in beautiful patterns. But there was nothing beautiful about the information he was sharing. "We must discuss the humans," Morvax said in his chiming voice. "I have studied their history extensively, and there are certain details that concern me." Admiral Catherall crossed his arms impatiently from his seat at the war table. "What concerns could possibly matter when we outnumber them 200 to 1? The Voranthi demanded. "They are primitive creatures with no natural weapons and a tiny fleet of outdated ships." Morvax's crystal form pulsed with an uncertain light. That is precisely what concerns me. Ambassador, because the humans should not exist at all. He changed the display to show a blue and green planet covered in vast oceans. This is Earth. The human homeworld, and in their relatively short history, they have survived no fewer than 5 extinction-level events, including ice ages that covered their world in frozen death, plagues that killed half their population, and asteroid impacts that wiped out entire species. So they are lucky. Supreme Commander Vrex of the Crix Collective clicked dismissively. Luck runs out. It is not luck, Morvax insisted. It is something else, something I do not fully understand. And look at this. The display changed to show images of human conflict throughout history, armies clashing with swords and spears, cities burning under bombardment, mushroom clouds rising over destroyed landscapes. The humans have spent most of their existence fighting each other. Morvax explained. They have developed war into what they call an art form. And they have created weapons capable of destroying their entire planet not once but many times over. Grand Admiral Thesara of the Morvathi leaned forward with interest. If they are so violent, why have they not destroyed themselves already? Because they are also capable of great restraint and cooperation when they choose to be, Morvax replied. They possess a quality that has no direct translation in any of our languages. But the closest approximation would be spite. Spite? Cathrall repeated the unfamiliar word. It means they will endure tremendous suffering and sacrifice simply to deny their enemy's victory. Morvax clarified. They would rather die fighting than surrender. And they take a strange joy in defying those who expect them to fail. The room fell silent as the commanders considered this information. You are telling us to be afraid of creatures who enjoy suffering? Rex clicked with amusement. This changes nothing. And we will crush them like every other species that has stood against the Concord. Morvax dimmed his light in the crystalline equivalent of a sigh. I am simply suggesting that we proceed with caution. Ambassador Cathrall stood and addressed the gathered commanders. Enough of this cowardice, and our fleet advances in 2 hours. And by tomorrow the human homeworld will be under our control. The meeting ended and the commanders returned to their ships. Meanwhile, 3 small human vessels approached the Concord Armada broadcasting. Signals of peace. They carried no weapons, and their shields were lowered in a gesture of trust. Ambassador Cathrall agreed to receive the human diplomatic envoy aboard the Eternal Mandate. Curious to see if perhaps the humans had finally come to their senses, the airlock opened and a single human male walked into the reception chamber. He was tall with dark skin and gray hair at his temples, and he wore a simple gray suit rather than any military uniform. His name was James Okonkwo, and he served as Earth's ambassador to the galactic community. Welcome aboard, Ambassador Okonkwo, Cathrall said with false politeness. I trust you have come to discuss the terms of your surrender. Okonkwo smiled warmly and held up a small container. Actually, I have come to offer you tea. Cathrall blinked his 4 eyes in confusion. Tea? It is a traditional human beverage made from dried leaves, Okonkwo explained as he began preparing 2 cups with practiced ease. We often share it during important negotiations as a sign of good faith. The Varanti commander watched in bewilderment as this human, whose entire species faced extinction, calmly prepared hot drinks as if they were meeting for a casual social visit. Do you not understand what is about to happen? Cathrall demanded. In 2 hours my fleet will begin its advance, and your pathetic defense forces will be swept aside like dust before a storm. Okonkwo handed him a cup and took a sip from his own. This is quite good tea. If I may say so myself, an ambassador, I understand perfectly what is about to happen. But I wonder if you do. Explain yourself. Human. The ambassador set down his cup, and his warm smile faded into something harder. You have studied our history, yes? Then you know what we are. And you know that every nation that has ever invaded human territory learned the same lesson. He began to pace slowly around the room. The Persians came to Thermopylae with the largest army the world had ever seen, and 300 warriors held them for 3 days. And even in death, those warriors became legends that inspired resistance for generations. Okonkwo turned to face Catherall directly. The Nazi Reich thought they could conquer Russia in a matter of weeks. And instead, they found themselves trapped in a frozen hell where the people would rather burn their own cities than let the enemy have them. And the Reich fell. Ancient history, Catherall scoffed. Irrelevant to the current situation, is it? Okonkwo asked with a raised eyebrow. The lesson is always the same. Ambassador, and humans do not surrender, and we do not submit. And we do not bow to those who would take our freedom by force. He stepped closer to the Varanthi commander. Your 40,000 ships? That is not enough, so bring more if you have them. And bring every weapon in your arsenal, and when the last of your warriors lies dead, and your empire crumbles to dust, we will still be here. Catherall felt his scales prickle with that same unease he had experienced during the transmission with Admiral Chun. You are bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You cannot possibly hope to defeat us. Okonkwo picked up his teacup and took another calm sip. Perhaps not, he admitted. Perhaps you will destroy us all, and perhaps every human world will burn, and our species will become nothing more than a memory. But I promise you this, Ambassador Catherall. His eyes locked with Catherall's 4. You will remember us. And you will count the cost of this war for the rest of your lives. And your children will ask why so many died to conquer one small species. And you will have no good answer to give them. The human finished his tea and set the cup down gently. Thank you for your hospitality, Ambassador. And I will return to my ship now and prepare for what comes next. He walked to the airlock and paused at the threshold. One more thing, Okonkwo said without turning around. My people have a saying that I think you should hear. And what is that? The human ambassador looked over his shoulder with a smile that contained no warmth at all. We say that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And you had your chance for peace, and now you will learn what happens when you corner a species. That is nothing left to lose. The airlock closed behind him. Catherall stood alone in the reception chamber for a long time afterward. His aide Desik eventually found him still staring at the empty teacup the human had left behind. Ambassador? Desik asked nervously. The fleet is ready to advance. Are you well? Catherall did not answer. He was thinking about the look in Ambassador Okonkwo's eyes. It was not the look of a man who expected to die. It was the look of a man who knew something his enemy did not. And far away on Earth, Admiral Chin Wei Lin received a coded message on her secure terminal. The message contained only 2 words, Prometheus Areon Elian. She smiled and began issuing orders to her fleet. The war was about to begin, and humanity was ready. The Concord Armada advanced toward Mars in perfect formation. 40,000 warships moving like a wall of death across the void of space. Ambassador Catherall stood on the bridge of the Eternal Mandate and watched the red planet grow larger on the view screen. According to intelligence reports, the humans had established a small military outpost on Mars with no more than 50 patrol vessels assigned to defend it. This would be the first and easiest victory of the war. All ships report ready for combat, Desik announced from his station. We will be in weapons range within 10 minutes. Catherall nodded with satisfaction and opened a channel to the other fleet commanders. This is Ambassador Catherall to all Concord forces. We will demonstrate our power with an overwhelming strike against the Mars colony. And there will be no survivors. And let this serve as a warning to the rest of humanity. The other commanders acknowledged the order and began positioning their ships for the assault. Supreme Commander Vrex of the Crix Collective was eager to unleash his swarm carriers. And Grand Admiral Dasara of the Morvathi had her planet crackers charging their main weapons. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, and then the sun exploded. That was what it looked like at first. As if their star had suddenly released a burst of energy directly at the Concorde fleet, a beam of pure concentrated light, brighter than anything Kethril had ever seen, cut through space and struck the Varanthi dreadnought carrier Hammer of Justice, the massive ship, home to 10,000 warriors and 500 fighter craft. Simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. Vaporized in an instant by a weapon that should not have been possible. What was that? Kethril roared as alarms blared across the bridge. Report! Thessic's claws trembled as he read the sensor data. Ambassador. The beam came from a network of satellites positioned around the sun, and they appear to be collecting and focusing solar energy into a weaponized beam. And our shields cannot stop it. Before Kethril could respond, another beam lanced out from the direction of the sun and destroyed a crystalline hegemony mirror ship, another beam, and another, each one erasing a Concorde vessel from existence. Evasive maneuvers. Kethril screamed. All ships scatter and break formation. The orderly wall of warships dissolved into chaos as captains desperately tried to dodge the beams of concentrated starlight. But the nightmare was only beginning. From the moons of Mars, from Phobos and Deimos, swarms of small craft erupted like angry insects from a disturbed nest. Thousands upon thousands of them, each no larger than a shuttle, raced toward the Concorde fleet with suicidal speed. Drone fighters, Desic reported, his voice shaking. They appear to be controlled by artificial intelligence. And there are no pilots aboard, and our sensors are counting over 50,000 of them. The drones slammed into Concorde ships without any attempt to fire weapons or dodge defensive fire. They simply crashed directly into their targets and exploded with the force of small nuclear bombs. Kethril watched in horror as ship after ship fell to the relentless swarm. The Krix carriers tried to launch their own drone fighters to counter the threat, but the human AI craft were faster and more maneuverable than anything the collective had ever produced. And then the human warships arrived. They were small compared to Concorde vessels, sleek and fast like predators hunting in a pack. There were only 200 of them against the thousands of Concorde ships that remained. But they fought as if the odds meant nothing at all. Human cruisers dove into the heart of the enemy formation and unleashed weapons fire from every angle. When their guns ran empty, they did not retreat. Instead, they accelerated directly toward the largest Concorde ships and activated their self-destruct systems. The explosions were massive, far larger than they should have been. Antimatter cores. Intelligence Chief Morvax reported over the fleet communication channel, his crystal voice filled with something that sounded like fear. They have rigged their ships with antimatter warheads, and they are using themselves as weapons. Ambassador. Kethril could not believe what he was seeing. These humans were throwing away their lives without hesitation, trading one small cruiser for a ship 50 times its size. And they were doing it with smiles on their faces. The Concorde communication frequencies were suddenly flooded with human transmissions, but they were not calls for surrender or pleas for mercy. They were jokes, actual jokes and laughter and strange human music playing at maximum volume. One human pilot broadcast his voice moments before ramming his ship into a Morvathi destroyer. Hey, ugly. Did you hear the one about the 12 admirals who walked into a trap? The punchline is you are about to find out. His ship exploded and took the destroyer with it. Another pilot, a young woman with fire in her eyes, sent a final message as her damaged cruiser limped toward a Krix carrier. Tell my mom I love her and tell these bugs that nobody messes with Earth. See you in Valhalla, you beautiful bastards. She hit the carrier at full speed, and the resulting explosion destroyed half the fighter swarm. It had been deploying. Kithril sank into his command chair, overwhelmed by the madness unfolding around him. Why do they laugh? He whispered to himself. Why do they laugh when they die? Desek had no answer. None of them did. The battle raged for 6 hours, and when it was finally over, the Concord had lost 3,000 ships and nearly 1,000,000 warriors. The humans had lost 170 vessels and 40,000 soldiers, by any rational measure. Humanity had suffered worse casualties in proportion to their forces, but they had won. The Concord fleet retreated in disarray, too shocked and damaged to continue the assault as they fled toward Jupiter to regroup. Ambassador Kethril received reports from the other commanders. The crystalline hegemony had lost half their mirror ships to the solar weapon they called the Prometheus Array, and they were questioning whether this war was worth fighting. The Crix Collective had never encountered an enemy that used suicide attacks as a standard tactic, and their warriors were shaken to the core. Even the ancient Morvathi, who had conquered 100 worlds in their long history, admitted they had never faced anything like the humans. Kithril stared at the damage reports and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong. They had come with the greatest armada ever assembled, and they had expected an easy victory. Instead, they had found an enemy that had prepared for this moment for 200 years, an enemy that had hidden weapons beyond imagination, while pretending to be weak, an enemy that laughed in the face of death and counted their own lives as acceptable payment for victory. Intelligence Chief Morvax contacted Kethril on a private channel. Ambassador, I have received intelligence from our agents on Earth, and it appears the humans have additional weapons we have not yet seen. What kind of weapons? Kethril asked, dreading the answer. They call it the Thanatos Protocol, Morvax replied. Every human colony, every city on Earth, is rigged with doomsday devices, and if we try to occupy their worlds, they will destroy everything rather than let us have it. Kethril closed his eyes. They would kill themselves just to deny us victory? Yes, Ambassador, Morvax confirmed. That is exactly what they would do. And I believe I finally understand why they laughed at our ultimatum. Tell me, they laughed because they had already accepted death, the intelligence chief explained. They had already decided that freedom was worth any price, even extinction. And when you have nothing left to lose, when you have made peace with the worst possible outcome, there is nothing left to fear. Kethril sat in silence as the weight of those words settled over him. They had come to conquer humanity. But how do you conquer a species that would rather die than submit? How do you break an enemy that finds joy in their own destruction? The Concord had made a terrible mistake, and now they were going to pay for it in blood far behind them on the red sands of Mars. Human soldiers celebrated their impossible victory and prepared for the battles to come, and they were still laughing. The Concord fleet had retreated to the moons of Jupiter, and what had begun as a united armada of 12 species was starting to crack like ice under pressure. Ambassador Kethril stood before a council of nervous commanders in the war room of the Eternal Mandate and listened to them argue about what to do next. We should continue the assault. Supreme Commander Vrex clicked impatiently. We still outnumber the humans 50-1. And one defeat does not change the math of this war. The math? Intelligence Chief Morvax chimed with disbelief. We lost 3,000 ships in 6 hours. And at that rate, we will have no fleet left before we reach Earth. Grand Admiral, the Tsar of the Marvathi slammed her fist on the table. The humans fight without honor, using machines instead of warriors and turning their own ships into bombs. And this is not war. And this is madness. Perhaps madness is exactly what we should fear, came a quiet voice from the corner of the room. Everyone turned to look at Etherian Ambassador Serenix, who rarely spoke at military councils. The Etherian was a being of pure energy contained in a crystalline shell, and their species had joined the Concord as healers rather than fighters. I have been monitoring human communication since the battle, Serenix continued. And do you know what they call this conflict? They call it Tuesday. Tuesday? Catherall repeated in confusion. It is a day of their week. Nothing special, nothing remarkable, just an ordinary day. And that is how they see this war against the greatest armada in galactic history. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They are not afraid of us, Serenix concluded. They are not even impressed by us, and that terrifies me more than any weapon they possess. Before anyone could respond, an aide rushed into the war room with urgent news. Commanders, we have intercepted a transmission from the Crystalline Hegemony flagship, and they are attempting to contact Earth directly. Catherall felt his scales flush with anger. They dare negotiate behind our backs? He stormed to the communication station and forced open a channel to the Hegemony vessel. Prism Lord Vexel, explain yourself immediately. The face of the crystalline commander appeared on screen, his form flickering with embarrassed light. Ambassador Catherall, the Hegemony has decided to withdraw from this conflict, and we believe the cost of victory is too high. You swore an oath to the Concord. Catherall roared. You cannot simply abandon the alliance when the battle becomes difficult. Difficult? Vexel's crystal body pulsed with anger. We lost half our mirror fleet to a weapon that uses their own sun against us, and we cannot defend against that. And we will not sacrifice our entire civilization for your wounded pride. The transmission ended within the hour. The Crix Collective also announced their withdrawal, followed by 3 more species who had decided the humans were simply not worth fighting. The Concord of 12 had become the Concord of 7 in a single day, but Catherall refused to give up. We still have enough ships to overwhelm their defenses. He declared to the remaining commanders, we will fortify our position here at Jupiter and wait for reinforcements from our homeworlds. And then we will finish what we started. The fleet dug in around Europa and Ganymede, building defensive platforms and laying minefields to protect against another human assault for 3 weeks. Nothing happened. The humans seemed content to wait, rebuilding their forces and making no aggressive moves. Catherall began to believe they had finally realized the futility of resistance. He was wrong. The human counterattack came without warning on the 22nd day. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin led a fleet of 300 vessels into the Jupiter system. Outnumbered 10-1 by the Concord defenders, any rational commander would have held back and waited for better odds. But the humans were not rational. They were something far more dangerous. They were creative. The human ships did not attack the Concord fleet directly, and instead they headed straight for the moons of Jupiter themselves. What are they doing? Catherall demanded as he watched the human formation on his tactical display. The answer came moments later when human vessels began firing massive harpoons into the surface of Europa. The harpoons trailed cables connected to powerful engines, and as the engines fired, they began to move the moon. Not much, just a slight adjustment to its orbit. But it was enough to send Europa crashing into the Concord defensive platforms that had been positioned around it. They are using the moons as weapons, Thesic cried out in disbelief. Human ships wove through the chaos, using the debris and the gravitational disruptions as cover while they struck at Concord vessels from unexpected angles. The Concord commanders tried to respond, but the humans seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing from impossible positions and vanishing before return fire could find them. And then the boarding parties arrived. Small human shuttles latched onto Concord vessels and cut through their hulls with plasma torches, spilling warriors in armored suits into the corridors within. The Concord had abandoned close quarters combat centuries ago. considering it primitive and unnecessary. When starships could destroy each other from thousands of kilometers away, the humans had not abandoned it. They had perfected it. Human marines tore through the hallways of Concorde ships with brutal efficiency, using weapons and tactics that seemed almost savage in their simplicity, knives and grenades and bare fists when necessary. Whatever it took to overwhelm their enemies. In the tight confines of a starship interior, the Varanti flagship Eternal Mandate was boarded by a squad of 40 human marines led by a sergeant named Rodriguez. They took the bridge in 17 minutes. Ambassador Cathrall found himself staring down the barrel of a human weapon, surrounded by the bodies of his guards and the wreckage of his command center. Surrender, Sergeant Rodriguez said calmly, and we will treat you with respect, or fight. And we will treat you with the respect you deserve for dying on your feet. Cathrall looked at the young human soldier and saw no hatred in her eyes. No cruelty, just a professional warrior doing her job. Why do you fight like this? He asked quietly. Your tactics are madness. Your willingness to die is insanity. And yet you win, so tell me why. Rodriguez lowered her weapon slightly. You want to know the truth, Ambassador? You made one mistake when you came here, and it was the same mistake every enemy of humanity has ever made. And what mistake is that? The sergeant smiled. You thought war was about winning. But for humans, war has never been about winning. And it has always been about making sure the other guy loses harder than you do. She gestured for her squad to take the ambassador into custody. We count our own losses, and we mourn our dead. But we also count your losses. And if the numbers are close enough, we call that a victory. Because we know something you do not. What do you know? We know that we can always make more humans, but you can never get back what you have lost today. And tomorrow, and every day, until this war is over. Cathrall allowed himself to be led away as his flagship fell under human control. The Battle of Europa ended with the Concorde losing another 5,000 ships and the capture of 7 high-ranking commanders. Including the ambassador himself, humanity had lost 200 vessels and 8,000 soldiers. They called it a great victory on Earth. Admiral Chen Wei-lin sent a message to the remaining Concorde forces, and her offer was simple: join humanity as equal partners in a new alliance, or face complete annihilation. The choice was theirs, and far away in the depths of space, the 5 species who had withdrawn from the Concorde watched the battle. Reports with growing wonder, perhaps these humans were not the enemy after all. Perhaps they were something else entirely. Perhaps they were the future. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Europa, and the galaxy had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The Treaty of Olympus Mons was signed on a clear morning on Mars, with representatives from 13 species gathered in a great hall built specifically for the occasion. Ambassador Cathrall stood among the other former enemies of humanity, his clawed hands clasped formally before him as he watched the human delegation enter the chamber. He was no longer a prisoner, and Earth had released him and all the other captured commanders weeks ago with full honors and no conditions attached. That gesture had confused him more than any weapon the humans possessed. Fleet Admiral Chen Wei-lin led the human delegation, walking with the same calm confidence she had shown when 40,000 ships arrived to destroy her world. Behind her came Ambassador James Okonkwo, still carrying that same warm smile he had worn when offering tea aboard the Eternal Mandate. The ceremony was brief and simple. Nothing like the elaborate rituals the Concorde used to mark the submission of conquered peoples. There was no submission here. Instead, the treaty established a new alliance of equals, the Concorde of 13, with humanity as a full partner rather than a subject race species that had come to enslave humanity, now stood beside them as friends. It made no sense to Cathrall, and he was not the only one who struggled to understand after the signing. A reception was held where humans and aliens mingled freely for the first time. Turl found himself standing alone by a window, watching the red Martian landscape beyond the dome while trying to process everything that had happened. "You look troubled, Ambassador." He turned to find Admiral Chan Wei-Lin approaching with 2 glasses of some amber liquid. "I thought you might like to try whiskey," she said, offering him a glass. "It is similar to the tea Ambassador Okonkwo shared with you, in that we drink it during important moments." Kethro accepted the glass and took a careful sip. The liquid burned pleasantly as it went down, and he found he rather liked it. "I do not understand your people, Admiral," he admitted. "We came to destroy you and enslave your species. And now you offer us friendship and alliance. So why do you not hate us?" Chen Wei-Lin looked out at the Martian sunset, her expression thoughtful. "May I tell you a story, Ambassador?" "Please." "When I was a young officer, I studied the history of human conflict extensively, and I learned that the longest and most bitter wars always end the same way, not with one side destroying the other, but with former enemies becoming partners." She turned to face him. "Germany and France fought 3 devastating wars in less than a century, and millions died, and cities burned, and hatred seemed eternal. But today, they are the closest of allies and the foundation of peace on our continent. How is that possible?" Catherall asked. "Because the humans who fought those wars eventually realized that their enemies were not monsters, and they were just people, frightened and angry, and fighting for what they believed was right." She gestured toward the gathering behind them, where a Varanthi warrior was attempting to learn a human card game, while a group of Kricks were fascinated by human music. "We could have demanded your surrender and your subjugation, and we had the power to do it after Europa, but what would that have gained us? Another enemy waiting for the chance to strike back. Another species teaching their children to hate humanity for generations." Chen Wei-Lin shook her head. "We have made that mistake too many times in our own history, Ambassador, and we have learned that true peace only comes when you turn your enemies into friends." Catherall considered her words carefully. "But we tried to exterminate you, and we showed no mercy, and we would have destroyed your entire species without hesitation." "Yes, you would have," the Admiral agreed. "And if you had succeeded, you would have lived with that crime forever. But you did not succeed, and now you have a choice." "What choice?" "You can spend the rest of your life hating us for defeating you, or you can accept our hand in friendship and help build something better than either of our species could create alone." She raised a glass. "The choice is yours, Ambassador, but I hope you will choose friendship, because I think the galaxy has seen enough war." Catherall looked at the human woman who had humiliated his fleet and destroyed his ambitions, and he saw no gloating in her eyes. He saw only hope. He raised his own glass and touched it to hers in the human gesture of fellowship, to friendship. Then he said quietly, "And to a future neither of us expected." Across the room, similar scenes played out as former enemies discovered they had more in common than they had imagined. Varanthi Elder found himself fascinated by human cooking and spent an hour learning about something called pizza, while a Krix warrior discovered that humans had invented a game called chess that perfectly suited the strategic thinking of his species, the Etherian. Healers were delighted to share medical knowledge with human doctors, and the crystalline hegemony found that human art and music created light patterns that their species found incredibly beautiful. Ambassador Okonkwo moved through the crowd, greeting everyone with the same warmth and making each alien feel welcome in a way that seemed almost magical. Catherall watched him and finally understood something important about humanity. They were not just warriors, they were also builders of bridges. Later that evening, retired Admiral Chan Wei-Lin gave a speech to a gathering of alien historians who had come to study humanity's remarkable psychology. "You asked why we laughed when your armada arrived. She began, and I promised I would eventually give you an answer. The room fell silent as dozens of alien species leaned forward to hear her words. The answer is simple, and it has two parts. She paused to look around the room, meeting the eyes of former enemies who were now colleagues. First, we laughed because we had spent our entire history fighting ourselves, and the deadliest predator we ever faced was our own reflection in the mirror. So when you arrived with your vast fleets and your ultimatums, you were not a threat. She smiled slightly. You were a relief? A relief? One of the historians asked. Yes, because finally we had an enemy we could fight without guilt. A war where we could be the heroes instead of the villains. And you gave us something we had craved for centuries. A reason to stop fighting each other and stand together as one species. She raised her glass again, for that gift. Even though you did not mean to give it, we thank you. The room was silent as the aliens processed this strange perspective. And the second reason? Another historian prompted. Chen Weilin's smile grew wider. The second reason is even simpler. And it is that humans have always laughed in the face of death, because the alternative is to cry. And crying takes too much energy that we could be using to survive. She set down her glass and spread her arms to encompass the room. We are a species that climbed down from the trees and looked up at the stars and said, we want to go there, and then we spent 10,000 years figuring out how to make it happen. And every obstacle, every disaster, every enemy that tried to stop us just made us more determined. You cannot break a species like that with threats, because we have already faced the worst that existence can offer, and we are still here. She laughed, and it was the same laugh that had echoed through the war room when the Concorde first sent their ultimatum. So yes, when your armada arrived for war, we smiled and laughed, because we knew something you did not. What did you know? Cathrall asked from the back of the room. Admiral Chun. Weilin looked at her former enemy with genuine affection. We knew that no matter what happened, win or lose, live or die, humanity would face it together. And we would face it with joy, because that is what it means to be human. The reception continued late into the night. And for the first time in galactic history, a dozen different species celebrated not a conquest but a partnership, and somewhere in the vast darkness of space, other ancient powers watched this strange alliance form and wondered if perhaps it was time to reconsider their own plans for expansion. The laughing species have proven themselves, and the galaxy would never be quite the same on a terraformed world that had once belonged to the Varanthi. Human children now played beside alien children under twin suns, their laughter mixing together in a sound that neither species had ever heard before. The sound of a future worth fighting for. Galaxy had come to humanity for war, but they stayed for the friendship, and that, in the end, was humanity's greatest victory of all.